Even Google can do your job, the CEO said, smiling like he'd just delivered a punchline instead of a termination. The room laughed on cue, nervous, obedient laughter from people who understood survival better than dignity. I remember the exact hum of the HVAC, the faint smell of burnt coffee, the way the glass conference room reflected my own face back at me, calm to the point of unsettling. 17 years, that's how long I'd been there. Longer than the CEO, longer than half the board, longer than the cloud infrastructure he liked to brag about in earnings calls. And in one sentence, tossed casually across a polished table, he decided I was obsolete. Replaceable, searchable. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even correct him. I just nodded, collected the thin folder HR slid toward me, and stood up while he was still enjoying the echo of his own confidence. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that he hadn't fired a worker. He defired a keystone. I cleaned out my desk the same day because that's what professionals do when they're underestimated. People watched from their cubicles like mourners at a quiet funeral, pretending not to stare while absorbing the lesson. Loyalty is temporary, silence is safer. My badge still worked when I passed through security, which told me everything I needed to know about how rushed and careless the decision had been. That night at home, I didn't update my resume. I didn't call recruiters. I poured a drink and opened my laptop not to code, but to read contracts, dependency maps, vendor agreements, and old emails I'd saved out of habit more than fear. Over the years, I'd become the person everyone went to when systems didn't talk to each other, when vendors blamed integration issues, when executives wanted answers without explanations. Somewhere along the way, I'd also become the quiet owner of institutional memory, the why behind decisions no one else remembered making. Google could find syntax. It couldn't find that. The first call came 3 days later, then another, then another. Systems that had never had issues before were suddenly brittle. Reports didn't reconcile. Automated processes stalled without throwing errors, the most dangerous kind of failure. The company's prized analytics dashboard, built on layers of assumptions I'd personally negotiated into existence, started producing numbers that were technically correct and strategically disastrous. No alarms went off because nothing was technically broken. It was all working exactly as designed. Just not as understood. By the end of the week, a vice president I'd trained years earlier left a voicemail that was half apology, half plea. By Monday, the CEO's executive assistant emailed asking if I'd be open to a short consulting engagement to help stabilize a few legacy workflows. Legacy. I smiled at that word longer than I should have. We met in the same conference room, same glass, same table, different posture. The CEO didn't joke this time. He didn't mention Google. He talked about continuity and unexpected complexity and the speed of modern systems. I listened politely, hands folded, letting the silence do the work I no longer had to. When he finally asked what it would take for me to come back, even temporarily, I slid a single page across the table. It wasn't a contract. It was a timeline, clear, factual, unemotional, showing exactly how long the company had before minor inefficiencies became material risks. Vendor penalties. Compliance exposure, investor questions, things Google couldn't fix without context and consultants couldn't fix without time. I didn't threaten, I didn't gloat. I just told him the truth he'd confused for irrelevance. I didn't go back as an employee. I went back as an advisor on my terms at a rate that made HR visibly uncomfortable and legal very quiet. My role wasn't to fix everything. It was to explain why things worked when they did and why they wouldn't without me. The CEO avoided jokes after that. He listened more. He spoke less. 6 months later, during a quarterly call, he thanked external partners for helping the company navigate a challenging transition. He never said my name. He didn't have to. I was already gone by then, building something smaller, quieter, and entirely mine. The funny thing about being told Google can do your job is that it reveals exactly how little someone understands about what you actually do. Search engines retrieve answers. Experience prevents disasters. And sometimes, the most expensive mistake a company makes isn't firing the wrong person. It's realizing too late that the job they thought was simple was the one holding everything together. He said it in front of everyone, too, leaning back in his chair with that casual cruelty executives learn when they've never personally paid the price for a bad decision. Even Google can do your job, the CEO laughed, gesturing vaguely toward the screen behind him, a slide deck full of buzzwords and outsourced optimism. The room chuckled on cue. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, not from embarrassment, but from disbelief. 17 years. 17 years of building systems that never made it into slides because when they worked, no one noticed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded because I already knew something he didn't, and because men who think software is magic words typed into a browser always underestimate the quiet ones who actually make the machines behave. The termination meeting came faster than I expected. No warning, no performance plan, no courtesy conversation. Just HR, a printed packet, and that same CEO checking his phone while explaining how AI-driven efficiencies had made my role redundant. He never once said thank you. He didn't need to. In his mind, the work had already been absorbed by the company, flattened into diagrams and assumptions. I handed over my badge, signed the papers, and walked out past people I'd trained, mentored, and quietly saved from disasters they never knew existed. The elevator ride down felt unreal, like stepping off a moving train without stopping first. But under the numbness was a calm certainty. They had fired the wrong person, not emotionally, not morally, but strategically. What the CEO didn't know was that Google couldn't do my job because my job wasn't searchable. It lived in the undocumented edge cases, the hand-tuned logic, the vendor relationships duct taped together over a decade and a half. It lived in the failover routines I rewrote after a midnight outage 6 years earlier, the ones never updated in the official docs because "we'll clean that up later" always lost to deadlines. And most importantly, it lived in a licensing clause no one had revisited since before he joined, one that required my sign-off for any third-party replication of the core decision engine. A clause legal had asked me to draft because back then I was the safest pair of hands. 3 days after I was fired, my phone rang. I didn't answer. Then my email lit up. Subject lines stacked like dominoes: urgent, quick question, need context. By day 4, the CEO himself left a voicemail, his voice suddenly stripped of humor. There was an issue, he said. The pilot with the automation vendor wasn't behaving as expected. Results were inconsistent. Clients were asking questions. Could I jump on a quick call just to clarify a few things? I listened to the message twice, then deleted it. I wasn't bitter, I was done. The board figured it out before he did. They always do. By the end of the week, legal reached out not to ask for help, but to ask for terms. Consulting, short-term, emergency. I named a number that made them pause, not because it was outrageous, but because it reflected the cost of pretending experience is replaceable. They agreed without negotiating. The CEO didn't attend that meeting. He resigned 2 months later officially to pursue new opportunities, though everyone inside the company knew why. The Google-powered future never launched. The system stabilized the moment I was back in the loop, on my terms, with my name on the contract. I still think about that line sometimes. Even Google can do your job. Maybe, someday, but not yet. And not without the people who quietly built the world those tools still rely on. He said it with a laugh, the kind that assumes the room is already on your side. Even Google can do your job, the CEO smirked, leaning back in his chair as if he'd just delivered a punchline. The conference room went quiet in that way that only happens when people are embarrassed for someone else. A few nervous chuckles followed, then silence. I remember looking down at my notepad, the ink from my pen bleeding slightly because I'd been pressing too hard without realizing it. 17 years. That's how long I'd been there. Longer than he'd been out of business school. Longer than most of the systems he now depended on had even existed. And yet there he was, reducing my entire career to a search bar and a soundbite, already signaling to HR with a subtle nod that the decision was final. The meeting ended quickly after that. No discussion. No review of performance metrics. No acknowledgement that the job he claimed Google could do involved holding together a Frankenstein monster of legacy systems, undocumented integrations, and regulatory landmines that only worked because I knew where the bodies were buried. HR asked me to stay behind. Everyone else filed out, eyes down, avoiding mine like guilt was contagious. The HR director slid a folder across the table with rehearsed sympathy. "This isn't personal," she said, which is always how you know it is. "We're moving in a more automated direction." I signed where they told me to sign. I handed over my badge. I smiled. That part seemed to confuse them the most. What they didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the job they thought could be Googled wasn't documented anywhere Google could see. Over the years, I'd become the quiet choke point in the organization, not by design, but by necessity. Every emergency escalation, every regulatory workaround, every temporary fix that somehow became permanent flowed through me. I was the one who knew which nightly batch process would silently fail if the data volume spiked, which vendor API would throttle without warning, which state regulator required a manual override before quarter-end reporting. Automation didn't replace that. It just hid it until it broke. My last day came and went without ceremony. I cleared my desk, nodded to security, and walked out into the parking lot feeling lighter than I had in years. By the time I got home, my phone had already started buzzing. First a former teammate, then a director, then someone from finance. I let them all go to voicemail. That evening, I poured a drink and sat on my back porch as the sun went down, watching notifications pile up. Somewhere around midnight, the tone of the messages shifted from confused to worried. By Monday morning, the CEO's confidence was unraveling in real time. The automated solution had gone live over the weekend. At 2:17 a.m., the reconciliation process stalled. By 6:00 a.m., downstream systems were out of sync. By 9:30, customer transactions were being flagged incorrectly, triggering compliance alerts across 3 states. The Google-powered future was hemorrhaging money by the minute. And the problem wasn't something you could search for because it wasn't a bug, it was an assumption. An assumption I'd been quietly compensating for years. At 10:12 a.m., I finally answered my phone. It was the CEO. His voice was different now, tighter, careful. "We may have underestimated the transition," he said, choosing each word like it cost him something. "Would you be open to consulting short-term just until we stabilize?" I let the silence stretch long enough to remind him of that conference room, of the laugh, of the way he'd said my job didn't matter. Then I named my rate, triple my old salary, paid weekly. Minimum 3-month contract. Advisory only. No on-call, no guarantees. He agreed without negotiating. By the end of the quarter, the company's automation initiative had quietly been restructured, which is corporate for abandoned. I didn't go back as an employee. I didn't need to. I showed up twice a week, fixed exactly what I was asked to fix, and documented nothing they hadn't already earned. The CEO stopped making jokes in meetings after that. People listened when I spoke. And when the contract ended, I walked away again, this time on my terms. Turns out Google can answer a lot of questions, but it still doesn't know who actually keeps the lights on. "Even Google can do your job," the CEO said, leaning back in his chair like he just delivered a mic drop instead of a termination. The conference room was all glass and steel, sunlight bouncing off a table that cost more than my first car, and every executive eye in the room slid toward me as if I'd just been exposed as dead weight. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just nodded once, the way you do when you already know how the story ends but let the other person enjoy the middle. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Google couldn't do my job, and neither could the person they thought they were keeping. I'd been at Horizon Metrics for 16 years. 16 years of being the quiet constant while leadership rotated like a broken carousel. I'd survived 3 CEOs, 2 mergers, and 1 spectacular IPO that everyone in that room still bragged about on LinkedIn. My title said Senior Operations Analyst, which was corporate shorthand for the guy who knows where all the bodies are buried and how the money actually moves. I wasn't flashy. I didn't dominate meetings. I built systems that didn't break, forecasts that didn't lie, and compliance structures that kept regulators from knocking. And somewhere along the way, that stopped being impressive and started being invisible. The new CEO, Evan, had been hired 6 months earlier with a mandate to modernize. Translation: cut costs, automate people, and replace experience with buzzwords. He loved saying things like AI-driven insights and self-serve analytics, usually while pointing at dashboards I'd designed years earlier. He mistook polish for understanding and confidence for competence. So when a junior director named Tyler, fresh MBA, perfect haircut, 0 institutional memory, told him my role was redundant, Evan believed him. Tyler had been presenting my work as his own for months, and I'd let it slide because I thought results mattered more than credit. That was my mistake. The firing itself was textbook corporate theater. HR rep on my left, legal on mute via Zoom, severance packet slid across the table like a peace offering. Evan smiled thinly and said they were moving in a more automated direction. Then came the line. "Frankly, even Google can do your job now." A few nervous chuckles followed. I caught Tyler smirking, already imagining my office with his name on the door. I signed nothing. I simply stood up, thanked them for their time, and walked out carrying nothing but my phone and a calm they mistook for defeat. What they didn't realize was that my job wasn't running reports. My job was understanding the invisible connections between departments, vendors, lenders, and regulators. I was the only one who knew why certain numbers couldn't be automated without context, why certain assumptions would trigger covenant violations, why a minor change in data timing could spook auditors or trip a loan clause. Those weren't written down because they lived in conversations, history, and judgment. Judgment doesn't scale, and it doesn't live in Google. My access was cut by noon. By Tuesday morning, Tyler was running my systems. By Wednesday afternoon, the first problem surfaced. Nothing dramatic, just a delayed reconciliation between two regional subsidiaries. Tyler shrugged it off. On Thursday, a vendor flagged an inconsistency. On Friday, the bank called asking why cash flow projections suddenly didn't match prior guidance. Evan assured everyone it was a transition hiccup. By Monday, the auditors requested an emergency review. I watched all of this from a distance, sitting in a quiet coffee shop with my laptop open, not touching a single system that wasn't mine. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply not there to quietly fix problems before they became visible. That had always been my real job, preventing embarrassment. Without me, Horizon Metrics was about to learn the difference between data and understanding. By the time Evan called me, 3 missed calls in a row, I already knew what he was going to say. The wrong person had been fired, and the irony was if he'd asked instead of mocked, I might have helped. But corporate arrogance has a way of teaching lessons the hard way. He said it with a laugh, like he was delivering a punchline instead of a termination. Even Google can do your job, the CEO smirked, leaning back in his chair as if he'd just demonstrated visionary leadership. Then he nodded to HR, who slid a thin folder across the table without meeting my eyes. 17 years reduced to a rehearsed sentence, and a severance packet that smelled like fresh toner. I remember noticing how quiet the room felt afterward, the kind of quiet that only happens when people think the hard part is over. They thought I'd argue, beg, explain myself. Instead, I thanked them for their time, stood up, and walked out with the same calm I'd used to keep systems alive at 3 in the morning when no one else knew where the switches were. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that my job wasn't the thing they saw on my calendar or the bullet points on my performance reviews. My job lived in the margins. It lived in the undocumented dependencies, the vendor handshakes held together by trust, the temporary workarounds that had become permanent because they worked. It lived in the fact that for a decade and a half, every major client escalation eventually landed on my desk, quietly, because I was the one who could fix it without blowing up the roadmap. Google could answer questions. Google couldn't remember why a certain batch job ran at 2:07 a.m. on Sundays or why a legacy client still authenticated against a retired endpoint. I could. And so could the quiet systems I maintained, systems that required my credentials to function as designed. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't touch a line of code. I simply did what the company had asked me to do years ago, document ownership. On my way out, I emailed compliance the access transfer checklist they'd ignored for months. I included notes about role-based approvals that would now be unstaffed, vendor renewals that required a named signatory, and the escalation matrix that by policy pointed to a single owner. Me, I CC'd legal. I CC'd the board liaison. Then I turned in my badge and went home, where my phone stayed quiet for exactly 6 hours. The first call came from operations, breathless and confused. A partner's data feed had frozen. Then finance called, settlements were delayed because a reconciliation job failed. By evening, sales was on the line, frantic, because a marquee client threatened to pause renewals unless someone explained why their dashboards were blank. "We just need a quick question answered," they said, voices suddenly respectful. I listened, I empathized. I explained calmly that I was no longer authorized to access company systems. Policy was policy. They should talk to the CEO. By the next morning, the tone changed. Legal called, then the interim COO, then finally the CEO himself. The laugh was gone. "We may have moved too quickly," he said, careful now, choosing words like a man stepping across thin ice. "We'd like to explore options." I told him I was open to a conversation through counsel. Consulting rates followed. So did conditions, independence, indemnification, and a clear scope. No more late-night heroics for free, no more being invisible until something broke. The board meeting happened without me, but I heard about it anyway. Slides with red numbers, timelines slipping. A realization settling in that search engines don't replace institutional memory. By the time they called back, the offer was different. Not a job, a contract. The kind that acknowledges value without pretending it can own it. I signed on my terms and fixed exactly what they paid for nothing more, nothing less. Weeks later, I ran into the CEO in the lobby after a status update. He looked tired. Older, he nodded, tight smile in place. "You were right," he said quietly. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I'd learned something more useful than revenge. Leverage doesn't shout. It waits. And when someone fires the wrong person because they confuse tools with talent, the lesson teaches itself. Even Google can do your job, the CEO said, smirking as he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled like he just delivered some profound truth. The room went quiet in that uncomfortable way, half the executives staring at the table, the other half pretending not to watch someone get dismantled in real time. Then he added casually, almost bored, "So we're eliminating your position. Effective today?" No warning, no discussion. 17 years distilled into a sentence and a security escort waiting outside the door. I didn't argue. That seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. I simply nodded, stood up, and thanked him for his time. As I walked out, I caught the faint flicker of satisfaction on his face, the look of a man who thought he'd just trimmed dead weight. What he didn't know was that he'd just removed the only person in the building who understood why half their systems hadn't collapsed years ago. By noon, my badge was deactivated. By 1, my email access was gone. By 2, my calendar had been wiped clean like I'd never existed. I drove home in silence, not shocked, not sad, just aware. Aware that something fragile had just been tampered with by someone who didn't know where the stress points were. The company ran on layers of automation stitched together over decades, and I was the one who'd written the glue code no one ever documented because it just works. I'd warned them for years that knowledge redundancy mattered more than headcount optics. They nodded, then ignored me. The first call came the next morning, not from HR, not from the CEO, from an operations director whose voice was tight with panic. Overnight batch jobs hadn't reconciled. Payments were stuck in limbo. A regulatory report failed to generate. "We think it's a permissions issue," he said. "It is looking into it." I wished him luck and hung up. By afternoon, the CFO called, then legal, then compliance, each conversation shorter than the last. Systems that Google could handle were unraveling in subtle, expensive ways, timeouts, mismatched data, cascading failures that didn't trip alarms but quietly poisoned downstream processes. The CEO finally called at 6:42 p.m. His voice had lost its edge. "We may have made a mistake," he said. "Let's talk about a consulting arrangement." I let the silence sit. Then I told him my rate. The board meeting 3 days later was standing room only. Losses were already approaching 7 figures. Regulators were asking questions. Clients were threatening audits. I joined by video, calm, prepared, and very clear. I would not be returning as an employee. I would consult temporarily to stabilize the systems. My rate was non-negotiable. My contract included a public acknowledgement of my role in the architecture and a written apology placed in my personnel file. The CEO didn't look at me once as the board approved every term. It took 6 weeks to fix what they'd broken in one meeting. When I was done, I documented everything they'd refused to fund for years, handed over the keys, and walked away for good. 2 months later, the CEO announced his resignation to pursue other opportunities. The company quietly rebuilt its engineering culture. And I moved on to work with people who understood that experience isn't something you can search for, and that firing the wrong person doesn't always look like a mistake until it's far too late.